Before we begin today's unbelievable courtroom story, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment below where you're watching from. If you enjoy powerful courtroom stories filled with shocking twists, emotional moments, and justice served, turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. Now let's begin. I have presided over thousands of cases during my years on the bench. I've seen greedy people, I've seen liars, I've seen criminals pretend to be victims. But I never expected a case involving $27 to leave an entire courtroom in tears. The morning began like any other. The courtroom was busy. Lawyers shuffled papers. The gallery was half full. People checked their phones while waiting for their hearings. Nobody expected anything unusual. Then the bailiff opened the door, and a homeless man walked into my courtroom. His clothes were worn. His shoes were falling apart. His gray beard looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. Several people immediately assumed he was in the wrong courtroom. Others looked away. Some even laughed quietly. The man carried a small paper pharmacy bag in one hand. Nothing about him seemed important, at least not at first. Across the room sat one of the most successful businesswomen in the state, Victoria Hartwell, 43 years old, founder of a billion-dollar technology company, cited in magazines, television interviews, business conferences. She had built an empire from nothing. At least that was the story everyone believed. Victoria sat confidently beside her legal team, expensive suit, perfect posture, professional smile. The kind of person who looked like she belonged in every room she entered. The homeless man looked like he belonged nowhere. The case file landed on my desk. I read the title. Then I looked up. Then I read it again, because it didn't make any sense. Victoria Hartwell was suing a homeless man named Samuel Brooks. The amount in dispute? $27. 27, not 27,000, not 27 million, $27. The entire courtroom looked confused. Even I was confused. I adjusted my glasses and asked the obvious question. Miss Hartwell, are you seriously bringing a lawsuit over $27? A few people laughed. Victoria didn't. Her expression remained cold, professional, controlled. Your Honor, she said, this isn't about the money. Whenever someone says that, it's usually about something much bigger. I leaned back. Now I was interested. Victoria explained that 3 days earlier, she had exited a downtown pharmacy after an important business meeting. According to her testimony, Samuel approached her and asked for $27. Not money for food, not money for transportation. Exactly $27. The specific amount caught her attention. She claimed she offered him cash, but instead of taking it, he allegedly stared at her and said something strange, something that frightened her. Victoria repeated the words in court. I knew you'd come back. The courtroom became quiet. Very quiet, she continued. According to Victoria, Samuel followed her for nearly a block while repeating the same sentence. I knew you'd come back. Then he smiled. Victoria said she felt threatened, harassed, stalked. Her attorneys immediately filed for a restraining order. Civil, straightforward, open and shut. At least that's what everyone expected. Then I looked towards Samuel. The homeless man hadn't spoken once, not a single word. He simply sat there, holding that little pharmacy bag. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. Finally, I asked him, Mr. Brooks, do you wish to respond? The room turned toward him. Samuel slowly stood. His hands trembled. For a moment, I thought he might be nervous. Then I realized something else. He wasn't nervous. He looked heartbroken. There's a difference, a very big difference. He reached into his coat pocket. Every attorney in the room immediately became alert. The bailiff took a step forward. Samuel slowly pulled out an old photograph. The edges were damaged, faded with age. He stared at it for several seconds before speaking. When he finally did, his voice cracked. Your Honor, he swallowed hard. I wasn't following her. Silence. The courtroom listened. Samuel looked directly at Victoria. For the first time since entering court, tears filled his eyes. Then he said the sentence that changed the entire case. I spent 20 years wondering if she survived. Nobody moved. Victoria looked confused. Her attorneys looked confused. Even I looked confused. Samuel held up the photograph. I asked for $27 because that's how much medicine I needed. He paused, then pointed toward Victoria. But when I saw her face, his voice broke completely. I thought I was looking at a ghost. The courtroom froze. Victoria's confident expression disappeared. For the first time all morning, she looked uncomfortable. Samuel slowly handed the photograph to the bailiff. The photograph eventually reached my desk. I looked down and immediately felt something strange. The image showed an old fire station. Several firefighters stood together, and in the center, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, covered in soot, wrapped in a rescue blanket. Being carried by a firefighter, the firefighter was Samuel. The little girl looked exactly like Victoria Hartwell. I slowly raised my eyes toward her. The color had completely drained from her face. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then Samuel whispered. I pulled her from a burning school. The courtroom exploded with whispers. Victoria stared at the photograph, then stared at Samuel, then back at the photograph again. Like her brain was refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. I felt the atmosphere change instantly. This was no longer about $27, not even close. I asked the obvious question. Do you have proof? Samuel nodded, then reached into the pharmacy bag and removed a worn fire department identification card, a newspaper clipping, and a document dated 21 years earlier. The bailiff carried everything forward. As I examined the records, my heart began pounding, because if these documents were genuine, then Victoria Hartwell had no idea who she was suing. And Samuel Brooks wasn't a random homeless man. He was the firefighter who may have saved her life. But before anyone could react, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. A man rushed inside, carrying a sealed evidence envelope. He walked directly toward Victoria's attorney, whispered something, and handed over the package. The attorney opened it, looked inside, and instantly went pale. I watched him carefully. Years on the bench teach you when something is wrong, very wrong. The attorney stood slowly. His hands were shaking. Then he looked at Victoria and said words that nobody expected. Victoria, he swallowed hard. You need to see this. The courtroom fell silent because whatever was inside that envelope had just terrified one of the most expensive lawyers in the state. And deep down, I knew this case was about to become something much bigger than any of us imagined. The courtroom remained silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every eye was locked on the sealed envelope sitting in Victoria Hartwell's attorney's trembling hands. I had seen experienced lawyers react to bad evidence before, but this was different. This man looked genuinely frightened. Victoria stood slowly. What is it? She asked. The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled several documents from the envelope and began flipping through them. The color continued draining from his face. Finally, he looked at me. Your Honor, I believe we need a brief recess. The request immediately caught my attention. Lawyers ask for recesses all the time, but they usually have reasons ready. This attorney looked like he was struggling to breathe. I shook my head. No. The courtroom became even quieter. If this evidence is important, we're discussing it here. The attorney swallowed hard, then slowly walked toward the bench. As he approached, I noticed Victoria staring at him with growing concern. The billionaire who had entered court completely confident now looked nervous, very nervous. The attorney handed me the documents. The moment I saw the first page, I understood why. It was a fire department incident report, 21 years old. Official, verified, authentic. I continued reading. Then my eyes landed on a specific section. And suddenly, my entire understanding of the case changed because Samuel Brooks had not rescued one child from that school fire. He had rescued two. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. I looked toward Samuel. The old firefighter sat quietly, completely unaware of what I was reading. I looked toward Victoria. She was equally unaware. Then I looked back at the report. The second child's name was partially redacted, but enough remained visible. Enough for me to understand why Victoria's attorney looked terrified. Because the second child connected directly to Victoria Hartwell's company. Directly. The prosecutor requested permission to review the document. I allowed it. Within moments, whispers began spreading among the legal teams. Something big was happening. Something nobody expected. Finally, I addressed the courtroom. Mr. Brooks. Samuel looked up. Did you rescue more than one child during the Lincoln Elementary fire? His eyes widened. Slowly, he nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The room froze. Victoria stared at him. The attorney stared at him. The gallery stared at him. Samuel continued quietly. There were two girls trapped on the second floor. My pulse quickened. Did both survive? Samuel hesitated, then answered. I always believed so. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Victoria looked confused. I don't understand, she said. Neither did most people. Not yet. I turned towards Samuel. What happened after the rescue? Samuel lowered his eyes. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he finally answered, and the room became emotional almost immediately. The building collapsed. He paused. The roof came down while I was still inside. Several jurors looked horrified. Samuel continued. My back was crushed. The courtroom remained completely silent. I never returned to duty. His voice cracked. The surgery started. Another pause. The medical bills started. Another. Then everything else disappeared. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody looked away. Because suddenly the homeless man wasn't just a homeless man. He was a hero, a broken hero. Samuel explained how he lost his career, then his savings, then his marriage, then his home. Over the next decade, one tragedy after another pushed him closer to poverty. Eventually, he was living in shelters, then on the streets. Yet somehow he never blamed anyone, not even the children he had saved. The courtroom was hanging on every word. Then Victoria asked a question, a simple question, a dangerous question. Why didn't you contact me? Samuel smiled sadly, the kind of smile that hurts to watch. Because I didn't know who you became. The room grew quiet again. I only remembered your face. Victoria looked down, Samuel continued. When I saw you outside that pharmacy, his eyes filled with tears. I recognized you immediately. Victoria didn't speak. Neither did anyone else. Then Samuel slowly reached into his coat pocket again. This time he removed a folded newspaper clipping. The paper was old, yellow, fragile. He handed it forward. When it reached my desk, I carefully unfolded it and instantly understood why he had carried it for 21 years. The headline read, Firefighter saves 2 children from deadly school. Fire underneath was a photograph, Samuel covered in soot, holding 2 little girls. One was clearly Victoria. The second girl's face was impossible to ignore because she looked almost identical to someone sitting in the courtroom, someone nobody expected, Victoria's attorney. The entire courtroom gasped. The attorney froze. Victoria turned toward him slowly. The attorney looked like he had seen a ghost. I stared at the photograph, then at him, then back at the photograph. Finally, I asked, Counselor, is that you? The attorney sat motionless. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he whispered, yes. The courtroom exploded. People stood up. Reporters rushed toward the exits. Court officers shouted for order because suddenly everyone understood. The attorney representing Victoria Hartwell was the second child Samuel had saved. The same child whose life he had risked everything to protect. The attorney removed his glasses. Tears filled his eyes. I never knew his name. The room became emotional immediately. I searched for years. He looked directly at Samuel. My parents searched for years. His voice cracked. We thought you died in that fire. Samuel looked completely stunned. The old firefighter seemed unable to process what was happening. 2 children, 2 lives saved, both sitting inside the same courtroom. 21 years later, the coincidence seemed impossible, but the biggest twist had not happened yet. Not even close, because the attorney slowly opened another document from the envelope, and the second he saw the contents, he started crying. Real crying, the kind grown men desperately try to hide. Victoria stood immediately. What is it? The attorney couldn't answer. Instead, he handed the document to her. Victoria read the first page, then the second, then the third, and suddenly she collapsed back into her chair. The entire courtroom watched in shock. The billionaire who had entered court looking powerful now looked completely broken. She covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. Then she looked directly at Samuel and whispered 4 words that nobody expected. You saved my mother. The courtroom went completely silent because whatever was written inside those pages had just revealed a secret buried for more than 20 years, a secret that connected Samuel Brooks to Victoria's family in a way nobody could have imagined. And for the first time since the hearing began, I realized the $27 were never the real story. The real story was hiding in that envelope, and it was about to change every life in that courtroom forever. The courtroom was completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the reporters standing near the doors seemed frozen. Victoria Hartwell sat staring at the documents in her hands while tears streamed down her face. Across the room, Samuel Brooks looked confused, lost, like a man who had walked into court expecting to defend himself against a restraining order and somehow found himself standing in the middle of a life he didn't know he had changed. I looked toward Victoria. You said he saved your mother. Victoria slowly nodded. The room remained silent. Then she stood for the first time since entering the courtroom. She no longer looked like a billionaire CEO. She looked like a daughter carrying 20 years of guilt. My mother never died from cancer. The courtroom became still. Victoria swallowed hard. That's what everyone believed. She looked towards Samuel, but she didn't die from cancer. Now everyone was listening, every single person. Victoria lifted one of the documents. My mother survived because of him. She pointed towards Samuel, then she continued. 3 months after the school fire, doctors discovered a dangerous heart condition. Samuel looked confused. Victoria continued. The reason doctors found it was because she was hospitalized after the fire. Another pause. The tests they performed during treatment discovered the condition early enough to save her life. The room went quiet again. Victoria's voice trembled. If Samuel had not rescued me, she stopped trying to hold back tears. If Samuel had not carried me out of that building, her voice finally broke. My mother would never have received those tests. The courtroom understood immediately. Without the rescue, Victoria dies. Without Victoria's rescue, her mother never receives treatment. Without that treatment, her mother dies years earlier. One act of courage had saved multiple lives, and Samuel never knew. Victoria looked directly at him. You didn't save one family. Tears rolled down her face. You saved generations of my family. Several people in the gallery began crying. The attorney, who had once been the second child rescued from the fire, quietly wiped tears from his eyes, but Samuel remained silent. Then he asked a question nobody expected. Is she still alive? Victoria smiled through tears and nodded. Yes. The courtroom gasped. Samuel slowly sat down, covering his face. For the first time all day, the old firefighter cried. Not because of money, not because of recognition, not because of sympathy. Because after 21 years of believing his sacrifices had destroyed his life, he finally learned they mattered. The room stayed quiet while he tried to regain control. Then Victoria walked forward, ignoring her attorneys, ignoring protocol, ignoring everything. She stopped directly in front of Samuel. The old firefighter slowly looked up. Victoria's voice barely rose above a whisper. I owe you my life. Samuel immediately shook his head. No. But Victoria continued. I owe you everything. The gallery erupted into applause. I immediately struck the gavel. But honestly, I understood why the emotion in that room was overwhelming. Then Victoria asked a question nobody expected. Why $27? The room fell silent again. Everyone wanted to know. Samuels looked embarrassed. He reached into the pharmacy bag, then slowly removed a prescription bottle. It's my medication. His voice cracked. I was $27 short. The courtroom went completely still. The richest woman in the room, the man who saved her life, and the entire lawsuit had started because he couldn't afford medicine. Victoria closed her eyes. Several people openly cried. Then Samuel said something that shattered whatever composure remained. When I saw your face, he smiled softly. I wasn't asking for money. Victoria looked confused. Samuel continued. I just wanted to know if you survived. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And suddenly the entire courtroom understood. The homeless man never cared about $27. He cared about the little girl he carried out of a burning building. 21 years later, that was all he wanted to know. Victoria sat down and cried, not quietly, not professionally. She cried like someone realizing she had spent years celebrating success while the man responsible for her future slept in shelters. Then came the moment nobody will ever forget. Victoria stood again, looked directly at me, and withdrew the lawsuit. Immediately, completely, without hesitation, the courtroom applauded again, but she wasn't finished. She turned toward Samuel and said, I'd like to make another offer. Samuel looked confused. Victoria smiled through tears. Come work for me. The gallery gasped. Samuel stared at her, speechless. Victoria continued. My company funds firefighter support programs. She pointed toward him. But the first person we should have helped, her voice cracked again. Was you? Samuel sat frozen. The attorney, sitting beside Victoria, smiled, then stood. And I'd like to help too. Soon another person stood, then another, business owners, veterans, community leaders. People throughout the gallery began offering support, job opportunities, housing assistance, medical care, legal aid. The scene became surreal. One by one, people stood up until nearly the entire courtroom was standing. Not because they were told to, because they wanted to. I have spent decades on the bench, thousands of hearings, thousands of verdicts, but I had never seen anything like it. Not once. Eventually, the room settled. I looked toward Samuel, the man who entered court as a homeless defendant, the man everyone judged before hearing his story, and I delivered the only words that felt appropriate. Mr. Brooks. He looked up. This courtroom owes you an apology. The room fell silent. I continued. People looked at your clothes. Another pause. They looked at your circumstances. Another. But they never looked at your character. The courtroom listened. Today reminds us that someone's value cannot be measured by their bank account. I looked around the room. The richest person here was never the billionaire. Then I looked directly at Samuel. It was the man willing to risk everything to save strangers. Silence. Then applause. Real applause. Not for money, not for status, for character, for sacrifice, for humanity. 6 months later, Samuel Brooks had a home, a job, medical care. And something even more important. A family. Victoria remained close to him. The attorney he saved became one of his closest friends. And every year afterward, they met on the anniversary of the fire, not to remember tragedy, but to celebrate survival. As for me, I still think about that case because it reminded me of something society forgets far too often. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody notices. And sometimes the man asking for $27 is worth more than every millionaire sitting beside him. That day started with a lawsuit. It ended with gratitude. And in all my years on the bench, I have never seen justice arrive in a more unexpected way.